Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Nights. And tonight, we have a collection of cozy, ancient mysteries. There is a story, and it may be true, about a dinner party in Paris in the year 1760. The guest of honor was a man who called himself the Count of Saint Germain. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody knew his real name. He spoke French, German, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, and several Eastern languages, with such fluency that native speakers of each assumed that he was one of their own. He played the violin like a virtuoso. He painted. He claimed to have perfected a technique for enlarging diamonds. He dressed immaculately, wore jewels on every finger, and never ate in public. At this particular dinner, the conversation turned, as it so often did around Saint Germain, to history. And the Count began to describe, in considerable detail, a conversation he'd had with Richard the Lionheart during the Crusades. He said it casually, the way you might mention something that happened last weekend. The other guests shifted in their chairs. The Count noticed and smiled, but did not correct himself. Later that evening, someone approached his valet, an elderly man who had served Saint Germain for as long as anyone could remember, and asked, half-joking, whether it was true that his master was 300 years old. The valet considered the question carefully. "I cannot say for certain," he replied. "I have only been in his service for 100 years. And this is where it begins, not with gods who live forever. Every culture has those, and they are easy to explain. This is about something else, something more unsettling. This is about people, or mortals, who simply did not die. Across continents and centuries, in civilizations that had no contact with one another, there are accounts of men and women who lived for centuries, or who turned up long after they should have been dust. Some of these accounts are myths, some are legends, and some of them have paperwork. Let's begin with the Count of Saint Germain, since we're already in his company. He first appeared in the courts of Europe around some time in 1710, though the exact date is uncertain because he seemed to already have been around for a while by the time anyone thought to write him down. Nobody could pin down his nationality. Nobody could trace his wealth, which was considerable. He carried loose diamonds in his pockets the way other men carried snuff. Over the next several decades, he moved through the highest circles of power in France, Germany, England, Russia, and Italy. Welcomed everywhere, trusted by monarchs, and understood by no one. He was received by Louis XV, who is famously suspicious of courtiers and their motives, yet who gave Saint Germain private apartments and a fully equipped laboratory. Voltaire, not a man given to credulity or to flattering anyone, called him a man who never dies and who knows everything. Casanova met him on multiple occasions across several years and was struck by how little he seemed to age between encounters. The Countess von Gorgi insisted, loudly and to anyone who would listen, that she had met this man, this exact man, in Venice 50 years earlier, and that he looked exactly the same, not similar, the same. These were not peasants reporting a vision in a field. These were diplomats, monarchs, and philosophers. People with reputations to protect, all saying roughly the same thing. This man does not age. This man knows things he shouldn't know. And Saint Germain himself did nothing to dispel the rumors. He would casually correct historical details about events from centuries past, with ease of someone who'd been there, and when pressed, he would simply smile. He never confirmed anything directly, but he never denied it either. He officially died on the 27th of February, 1784, in the court of Prince Charles Hesse-Kassel, one of the few men Saint Germain seemed to have considered a genuine friend. He was buried, and the matter should have ended there. But it didn't. Reliable accounts place him at the French Revolution in 1789. Countess d'Adhémar wrote in her memoirs that he appeared to her and warned her of the bloodshed to come. The terror, the fall of the monarchy, with the resigned sadness of someone describing something he had already seen play out. She also noticed that he appeared no older than when she had seen him decades earlier. There are reports of him in the early 1800s, in the 1900s. An alleged photograph from the earliest 20th century circulated for years. Annie Besant claimed to have met him in 1896. The descriptions never changed. The immaculate dress, the jewels, the knowledge of things no living person should ever remember. He is either the most extraordinary con artist in European history, or something that doesn't have a comfortable explanation. Next, there is Nicolas Flamel. Now, on the surface, his story is modest. He was a Parisian scribe and bookseller born around 1330, who lived a quiet, prosperous life with his wife. He donated money to churches. He commissioned headstones. He died on the 22nd of March, 1418, and was buried in the Church of the Holy Innocents His will survived. His tombstone survived. His legacy by all rights should have been a footnote. Except that in the decades and centuries after his death, travelers began to report seeing him. A man matching his description was reportedly encountered in Turkey, then in India. Always older but very much alive and in the company of his wife, who had supposedly died before him. The alchemist Paul Lucas, traveling through the Ottoman Empire in the early 1700s, nearly 3 centuries after Flamel's death, met a dervish who told him matter-of-factly that Flamel was alive and well, and that he and his wife had faked their deaths, and that they were living in the East. Then there is the matter of the tomb. Later accounts claimed that when Flamel's grave was eventually opened, the details vary on exactly when and by whom, but that it was empty. No body, no bones. The headstone was there, the records were there. The man was not. Whether this is true or simply the kind of detail that attaches itself to a good story, no one can say for certain, but it has been repeated for centuries, and no one has convincingly put it to rest. The explanation that attached itself to Flamel, and that has never quite let go, is the Philosopher's Stone. The legend says he acquired a mysterious book, the Book of Abraham the Jew, and that through decades of study he decoded its secrets. The stone, in alchemical tradition, was not primarily about turning lead into gold, though it could supposedly do that. The real prize was the elixir of life. The transmutation of metal was a side effect. The transmutation of mortality was the point. Whether Flamel ever found such a thing, no one can say. What the records show is a modest scribe who lived a comfortable life, gave generously to the poor, and died at a reasonable age for his era. What the legend insists is something else entirely. An empty tomb, a wife who should have been dead walking beside him through distant countries, and a secret that outlived everyone who might have explained it. Of all the immortality stories in European history, Flamel's is the quietest, the most domestic, and for that reason perhaps the most unsettling. The Count of Saint Germain was flamboyant enough to be dismissed as a performer. Flamel was a bookseller. Booksellers do not usually become legends, unless something genuinely strange might have happened. And then, further east and further into strangeness, there is Li Ching Yen. According to various accounts, some more reliable than others, all of them extraordinary, Li Ching Yen was a Chinese herbalist, martial artist, and tactical advisor who was born in 1677 and died in the May of 1933. If true, he lived to the age of 256. The New York Times ran his obituary. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a folk tale passed down through villages. One of the most respected newspapers in the world reported his death and his age as a matter of record. A 1930 New York Times article had noted that Professor Wu Cheng-chia of Chengdu University had found imperial Chinese government records congratulating Li on his 150th birthday in 1827, and further records congratulating him on his 200th in 1877. Li Cheng himself, when asked for the secret of his longevity, offered advice that was either profound or evasive depending on your inclination. "Keep a quiet heart," he said. "Sit like a tortoise. Walk sprightly like a pigeon. Sleep like a dog." He was a practitioner of Qigong and a herbalist who consumed goichi berries and wild ginseng throughout his life. He reportedly had over 200 descendants and outlived 23 wives. When he was asked near the end of his life whether he had any regrets, he said nothing about the centuries he had supposedly witnessed. The fall of dynasties, the wars, the turning of ages. He said he regretted nothing, except that he had not been able to remain more still. He was either the longest lived human being in recorded history or one of the most peculiar cases of identity confusion ever documented. Scholars have suggested that his birth records may have belonged to an ancestor, or that multiple generations of herbalists in the same lineage were conflated into one person. These are not reasonable explanations, but no one has proven any of them, and the New York Times, for whatever it is worth, printed his age without qualification. Now, not everyone who lived forever chose it. Some of the most haunting immortality stories across human cultures are not stories of triumph. They are punishments. And the punishment is always the same. You wanted to live. Now you can never stop. The most widespread of these figures is the Wandering Jew, or known as Ahasuerus, or by no name at all. The legend runs as follows. When Christ was carrying the cross to Calvary, he paused to rest against the wall of a house. The owner of that house, a cobbler in most versions, struck him or drove him away, telling him to move on. Christ apparently looked at him and said, "I go, but you shall wait until I return." And so the man walks. He has been walking for 2,000 years. Reported sightings of the wandering Jew span 13 centuries and stretch across the whole of Europe and beyond. He was seen in Hamburg in 1547, where a bishop named Paulus von Eystein claimed to have spoken with him at length and found him fluent in every language but consumed by grief. He was reported in Spain, in England. In the Ural Mountains in Scandinavia, he appeared in different cities under different names, but the description was always remarkably consistent. A tall, gaunt man with deep-set eyes, who carried an impossible weight of years and knew too much, far too much, about the streets of ancient Jerusalem, about everything. The earliest written account of him comes from a chronicle by Roger of Wendover in 1228, who recorded the testimony of an Armenian archbishop visiting England. The archbishop claimed to have personally dined with the man, who was at the time called Cartaphilus, and to have heard his story firsthand. From there, the sightings multiply across centuries through the medieval period, the Renaissance, as well as into the modern era. As late as 1868, a Mormon apostle in Salt Lake City reported an encounter with a mysterious wanderer who identified himself as the same man. What makes the Wandering Jew distinct from other legends is the texture of the sightings. These are not glimpses, not fleeting figures on a dusk road. People claim to have sat with him, spoken with him for hours, heard him describe events from 2 millennia ago with the weariness of someone who had seen everything. He is not a trickster like Saint Germain. He is not a mystery to be solved. He is more a tragedy to be witnessed. And in every account, the same detail recurs. He does not want to be alive. He is not clinging to existence. He is enduring it. Half the world away, in a tradition far older than Christianity, there is another figure who walks and cannot stop. His name is Ashwatthama, and his story is told in the Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic of ancient India. Ashwatthama was a warrior, the son of Drona, one of the greatest teachers of arms the world had known. And during a cataclysmic war, after his father was killed through deception, he committed an act of terrible vengeance. He crept into the enemy camp at night and slaughtered warriors in their sleep, including children. In some versions, he unleashed the Brahmastra, a weapon of divine destruction against the unborn. For this crime, Krishna cursed him. The jewel that had been embedded in Ashwatthama's forehead since birth, a gem called the Mani, which had granted him protection from all earthly dangers, disease, weapons, hunger, thirst, fatigue, was torn from his flesh, leaving a wound that would never heal. and Krishna spoke the sentence. Ashwatthama would wander the earth for 3,000 years alone in pain, with that open wound weeping on his forehead, unable to die and unable to find rest. He would carry the memory of what he had done through every waking moment of those 3,000 years. The wound would not let him forget. The loneliness would not let him forget. And no one would help him, because no one could. This is not ancient history in the way that it might be in Western tradition. In parts of India, Ashwatthama is present tense. There are villages, particularly in and around the forests, where people claim to have seen him. A large man walking alone through the trees at night. The wound on his forehead will not close and blood that will not dry. Tribal communities in the region have reported encounters for generations. Some say he comes to the temples before dawn when no one else is there and leaves offerings of flowers stained with blood from the wound. Others say he has been seen asking villagers for turmeric and oil, substances that might soothe the wound. Offerings are sometimes left at the edges of forests for him, not out of worship, out of pity, and perhaps out of the quiet, an inherited understanding that some fates are worse than death. Ashwatthama is one of the Chirunjivi, the 7 immortals of Hindu tradition, who are, according to scripture, alive at this moment. Not dead and remembered, not ascended to another plane, not symbolic, alive, walking the earth as these words are spoken. Hanuman, the devoted servant of Lord Rama, is another, though his immortality is a blessing, not a punishment. Parashurama, the 6th avatar of Vishnu, the warrior with the axe, who purged the earth of corrupt kings 21 times over, is said to be meditating somewhere in the mountains, waiting for the age to turn. Vyasa, the sage who composed the Mahabharata itself, is said to be another of the 7. The author of the story is still alive inside his own story. According to tradition, these beings have not died, and will not die until the end of this age of the world. They are out there right now, maybe even listening to this. There is a layer beneath all of this, older than history, older than any individual name or story, and it is arguably the strangest part. Before the first cities were built, before the first written languages developed beyond tallying grain and livestock, 2 civilizations, separated by geography, culture, and possibly by millennia, recorded the same impossible thing. The Sumerians, who built the earliest known civilization in Mesopotamia, kept a document called the Sumerian King List. It It is one of the oldest pieces of writing in the world, and it records, in the same matter-of-fact administrative tone as any census or tax toll, that the early kings of the world ruled for tens of thousands of years each. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,000 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000. Another ruled for 43,000. The numbers are staggering, absurd, impossible by any modern understanding of human biology, but the scribes who wrote them down did not present them as legends. They are listed in the same format, the same bureaucratic indifference as every other king on the list. And then something happens. The text reads, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, the rains drop dramatically. The first post-flood king, Jushur of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years. Still extraordinary, but a fraction of what came before. And the numbers keep falling, generation by generation, until they reach plausible human lifespans. Dozens of years, not thousands. Almost like something broke, as if some mechanism that had sustained those early lives was switched off or washed away, and humanity began to wind down the clock. Now, consider Genesis. The Hebrew scriptures record almost exactly the same pattern. Adam lived to 930 years, Seth to 912, Enosh to 905, Methuselah, the oldest of them all, to 969. These figures are presented in genealogies, not poems, not parables, lists. And then the flood comes. After the flood, Noah lives to 950. But his descendants do not. Shem lives to 600, Arpachshad to 438, Shelah to 433. The numbers seem to tumble generation by generation, in what reads almost like a decay curve, a frequency dropping, until Abraham dies at 175 and Moses at 120. And the age of impossible lifespans is over. Whatever had sustained those early lives was gone, spent, diluted. The world after the flood was the same world, but something fundamental about it had changed. Two civilizations, two completely independent traditions, same story. Unthinkable longevity before a flood, followed by a sharp, irreversible decline, as if something had been taken away, as if the flood didn't just drown the world. It drained something out of it. But there are sensible explanations for all of this. Sumerian numbers may be symbolic. Mathematical constructs in a base 60 system, representing something other than literal years. The Bible lifespans may be theological, a way of saying the world grew dimmer as it moved further from its source. But neither text reads like symbolism. Both read like records, both sit inside longer documents that transition, without any change in tone or format, into historically verifiable events and people. The impossible parts and the possible parts are written in the same hand, in the same voice, as though it were all simply what happened. So, what are we left with? A count who attended dinner parties for centuries. A scribe whose tomb was supposedly empty. A herbalist whose government couldn't keep track of his age because he outlived their records. A cobbler who was cursed to walk the earth till the end of time. A warrior bleeding in the forests of India. Two ancient civilizations, worlds apart, writing down the same impossible arithmetic. Three stories span centuries and continents. They cross boundaries of language, religion, culture. And they share a peculiar quality that is easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The Immortals seem to suffer. Not all of them, but most. And the older the story, the sharper the suffering. Ashwatthama wanders in agony. The wandering Jew walks in grief. Tithonus, in Greek myth, was granted eternal life by Zeus at the request of Eos, the goddess of the dawn who loved him. But she forgot to ask for eternal youth. It is one of the cruelest details in all of mythology, the small omission. One word left out of the wish and it becomes a nightmare. So, Tithonus aged and kept aging, shriveling and shrinking, his skin like parchment, losing his mind, and his body with his life burned on without end, and he begged for death, but it would not come. It had been told not to. Eventually the gods took pity, or perhaps grew tired of listening and turned him into a cicada. His voice remains, dry, rasping, but everything else is gone. Even the goddess who had loved him could not bear to look at what he had become. She turned away. Dawn still comes every morning, but she does not look back. Even Saint Germain, if the stories are true, presents a picture that is less inviolable than it appears. A man with no home, no country, no family, always arriving, always charming, always leaving, never still, never known, moving through centuries like a stone skipping across the water. Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels imagined a race of immortals called the Struldbargs. They could not die, but they could not stop aging either. By 80 they were senile. By 100 they were decrepit beyond recognition, unable to converse because the language itself had changed around them, while their minds crumbled. They lived on, forgotten by everyone, understanding nothing. Swift meant it as satire. It reads like something written by a man who had listened very carefully to the old stories. There is a pattern here, and it's worth naming. The old stories, the ones with roots, the ones that survived because they carried something true. Almost always, they treat immortality as a curse. The old stories understood something that the modern imagination has largely forgotten. That death is not only an ending, it is a boundary. And boundaries are what give shape to a life. Without them, a life is not longer, it is formless. Perhaps these stories are warnings. Perhaps they are the way cultures process the terror of death by imagining something worse. Or perhaps, and this is a thread that will not tie itself neatly, perhaps some of them are records. The Sumerian king list was not written as mythology, it was written as administration. Genesis was not written as poetry. It was written as genealogy. The witnesses who saw Saint Germain were not mystics sitting in darkened rooms, they were diplomats and kings. None of this proves anything. Proof is not the currency of stories this old. But proof is not the only thing that matters either. What matters is the question. Why do so many civilizations across so many centuries tell stories about people who do not die? There is a house on the bank of the Thames, a little way upriver from London, and inside it is the greatest library in England. Not the greatest private library, the greatest library, full stop. More books than Oxford holds, more than Cambridge. Thousands of volumes gathered from across all of Europe by a single man over a single lifetime. Books on mathematics and astronomy and navigation, on medicine and history, and the movements of the stars, and on certain shelves in certain locked cases. Books on subjects that his neighbors would have been very frightened to know that he owned. This is the house at Mortlake, and the man who built that library is the cleverest man in England. And one night while he is away, a mob comes for it. They have decided he is a sorcerer, a conjurer, a man who speaks with the devils. And so they break into his house, and they begin to tear the library apart, burning, smashing, scattering a lifetime's collection along the muddy bank of the river. By the time it is over, a great part of the most important collection of knowledge in the country is gone. And here is the strange thing. The mob was not entirely wrong, because the man who owned that library was the Queen's trusted advisor, astrologer to Elizabeth herself, and the scholar she turned to, a mathematician whose work guided England's ships across uncharted oceans. And he was also, by the end of his life, a man who spent his evenings staring into a polished stone, writing down the words of angels dictated to him by a convicted criminal. How does one man become both of those things at once? The most learned mind of his age, and a devil in the eyes of his own street? That is the question we are going to follow tonight. The story of John Dee, scholar, spy, sorcerer, or fool. The one voice he wanted so badly to be real that it cost him everything. To understand how far he fell, you have to understand how high he stood. And he stood very high indeed. John Dee was born in London in 1527, the son of a minor official at the court of Henry. And from boyhood, it was plain that his mind was something rare. He went up to Cambridge as a teenager and worked, by his own account, 18 hours a day. 4 for sleep, 2 for meals, 18 for study, which does not quite add up and tells you everything about how he wished to be remembered. He was so accomplished that he was made a founding fellow of Trinity College while still barely an adult. But England, to Dee, was a small and provincial place, and the real learning was on the continent. So he crossed to the Low Countries and threw himself into the company of the greatest scientific minds of the age. He studied with the map-maker Gerardus Mercator, the man whose way of drawing the world we still use today. And he came home carrying instruments and globes and a knowledge of mathematics and navigation that almost no one else in England possessed. And this is the part that matters. The part that should sit underneath everything stranger that follows. Dee was not a crank. He was one of the genuine intellects of the 16th century. He understood mathematics at a level his countrymen could barely follow. So much so that ordinary people assumed that anyone who could do such things must be doing them with the help of spirits. Because what other explanation could there be? He helped lay the groundwork, the intellectual groundwork for English exploration, advising the navigators who would push out across the Atlantic in search of a northern passage. He is also credited with coining a phrase to describe what England might one day become: the British Empire. He held in his head much of the practical knowledge that would build a nation's reach across the world. When young Elizabeth came to the throne, it was John Dee she trusted to choose the date of her coronation, to read the stars and find the most favorable day for a reign to begin. Think about that. The future of a kingdom, the most important date of a generation, placed in the hands of this one scholar and his astrology. That is how completely the age believed in him. That is the height from which the rest of this story descends. He was, in the fullest sense that the period allowed, a magus, a word that meant not a stage conjurer, but a wise man, a master of hidden mathematics that ran beneath the visible world. And to Dee there was no wall between the science we recognized and the magic we would not. Astronomy and astrology were one study. Mathematics and the secret architecture of creation were one subject. He did not see himself as crossing from knowledge into superstition. He saw one single vast body of truth, and he meant to learn the whole of it, every last part, including the parts that no living human was supposed to know. The ambition is the seed to everything. Hold onto it. For a time, a long time, he was untouchable. Dee was not merely the Queen's astrologer. He was something closer to her private scholar, a man she would visit, a man whose counsel she sought on matters far beyond the stars. When a wax figure of Elizabeth was found in a field with a pin driven through its heart, an apparent act of witchcraft against the crown, it was Dee who was called upon to counter the curse. When a fearful comet blazed across the sky, and the whole country trembled at the omen, it was Dee the Queen summoned to tell her what it meant. He stood at the very center of the kingdom's secret life, the man who read the signs the rest of the court could not. And there is a thread here that has grown over the centuries into one of the most enduring legends attached to his name. So let me give it to you, and then tell you honestly how much of it to keep. See, the legend says that John Dee was a spy, that as he traveled across Europe, he gathered intelligence for the English crown and sent it home in secret. And it says that he signed those secret reports with a private mark, a number meant for the Queen's eyes alone. 2 small circles, like 2 eyes, followed by an elongated stroke. The 2 eyes, the story goes, meant for your eyes only, and the whole symbol, this number, 007 was his signature as the Queen's own confidential agent. Centuries later, the legend insists a writer borrowed it for a fictional spy. And so the cleverest man in Elizabethan England became the secret ancestor of James Bond. It is a wonderful story, treated gently. The truth underneath it is real enough. Dee genuinely travelled widely, genuinely had the Queen's confidence, and genuinely operated in a world where a scholar abroad and an intelligencer abroad were often the same man. But the neat tale of 007's signature is mostly the work of later writers, polished into legend long after the fact. What we can say plainly is this: he was close to power, trusted with secrets, and moved through the courts of Europe with the quiet authority of a man who answered to a queen. So, picture him at his height. The royal favor, the vast library, the instruments and the globes, the most learned man in the land consulted by the throne, his name spoken with a mixture of awe and unease the length of the kingdom. He had almost everything a mind like his could want. Almost. There was one door still closed to him. The largest one. The one his entire life had been a slow approach toward. He had mastered the knowledge that men could teach. He had read, it seemed, every book worth reading, and it was not enough. There was a deeper knowledge he could not reach by study alone. The knowledge of the angels. The secret language in which God had made the world. And there was no book that contained it. If men could not teach him, he would have to ask something higher. And to do that, he would need someone who could see what he could not. This is the turn. Everything before it is the ascent. Everything after it is the long, strange fall. By the early 1580s, Dee was a man in his 50s, brilliant, restless, and quietly desperate. He had spent decades trying to reach the divine knowledge he believed lay just beyond human learning. And he had tried, on his own, to make contact with the spirit world. Staring into crystals, praying, waiting for a voice. Nothing came. He did not have the gift of sight himself. He needed a scryer, a man who could gaze into a polished stone or a mirror and see the spirits that Dee could only long to reach. And then, in 1582, such a man arrived at his door. His name was Edward Kelly, though that may not have been the name he was born with, and almost everything about him should have set the alarm bells ringing. He was younger than Dee, sharp, persuasive, and trailing a dark history. By many accounts, his ears had been cropped, a punishment for forgery, the mark of a convicted criminal carried for life. He was rumored to have dabbled in necromancy, in raising the dead to tell the future. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man a wise person keeps at arm's length. Dee took him into his home. And so, the seances began. Kelly would kneel before the show stone, crystal sphere, and later a disc of polished obsidian, a black Aztec mirror that had somehow found its way to England. And he would describe what he saw. Angels, figures of light, a child spirit named Madame, who appeared as a little girl. And Dee, the great scholar, sat beside him with his pen, writing down every word, recording these conversations in meticulous detail, treating each session as the most important research of his life. What the angels delivered over months and then years was extraordinary. They dictated through Kelly an entire language, a tongue they called the speech of angels, the language Adam had spoken in Eden, the words in which God had spoken creation into being. We call it Enochian today, after the biblical Enoch, who was said to have walked with God. It had its own alphabet, its own grammar, its own great tables of letters that the angels dictated square by square, sometimes backwards, to prevent the dangerous words from taking effect as they were transcribed. It was a complete, intricate, internally consistent system. And to this day, people argue about where it came from. Because here is the honest difficulty. Edward Kelly was almost certainly a fraud. The evidence points that way and always has. A forger by record, a man entirely dependent on a wealthy patron, producing visions that conveniently kept the patron enthralled. The simplest explanation is that he invented it all, spinning out angelic theater to keep a roof over his head, a great man's faith fixed upon him. And yet, the Enochian system is so elaborate, so strange, so unlike a quick confidence trick, that even skeptics have struggled to explain how an unschooled forger improvised it night after night without contradiction. So we are left with the unsettling shape of it. The most learned man in England, who could see through any argument and master any book, sitting at the feet of a cropped-eared criminal, writing down his every word as gospel. The genius and the fraud locked together, and the genius could not, would not see it. That is the thing about wanting something badly enough. It does not make you stupid, it makes you blind. Dee could navigate empires. He simply could not look directly at the one man he most needed to be telling the truth. Then in 1583, the two men left England. A Polish nobleman passing through London became fascinated by Dee and his angelic conversations, and invited the whole strange household to the continent. And so Dee packed up his family, and Kelly packed up his, and together they began years of wandering across Europe in turmoil, chasing patronage, performing their seances for any noble who would listen, always moving, always hoping the next great man would be the one to fund the work. They made their way to the courts of Central Europe, and eventually into the orbit of one of the most extraordinary rulers of the age, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who held his court at Prague. Rudolph was a man after Dee's own heart and Dee's own weakness, an emperor obsessed with the occult, with alchemy, with astrology and strange machines and the secret workings of nature, who filled his castle with magicians and astronomers and seekers of the philosopher's stone. To a wandering pair of angel talkers, it should have been the perfect harbor. Dee secured an audience with the emperor and delivered to him a warning straight from the angels, that Rudolph must reform his life, must turn from his sins, or face divine judgment. It was not perhaps the most politic thing to say to an emperor. The reception cooled, and there was the constant circling suspicion of the church, which watched these two foreigners and their crystal and their talks of spirits with deep unease. They were nearly always one accusation away from real danger. Through it all, the seances continued. Kelly's angels grew more powerful, more demanding, and conveniently more inclined to elevate Kelly himself. He was by now increasingly drawn to alchemy, to the pursuit of the stone that would turn base metal into gold, and there were claims that he had actually done it, that he possessed a mysterious red powder that could perform the transmutation. Whether anyone ever truly saw gold made, we cannot say, but Kelly's star was rising and Dee's slowly was falling, the master becoming dependent on the servant, and the scholar increasingly at the mercy of the scryer's visions. And then came the command that broke it. In 1587, Kelly reported a new instruction from the angels, one so shocking that even Dee recoiled at first. The angels decreed that the two men should hold all things in common. All things, including their wives. We do not know everything that followed. We know that Dee was horrified, that he even agonized over it, that he searched his conscience and his faith. And we know that in the end, he appears to have submitted to it, convinced or half convinced that to refuse an angel was a greater sin than to obey one. It is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in the whole story, and it is the moment the seances curdle from wonder into something darker. The point at which a reasonable observer can no longer avoid the obvious reading. That Kelly was a manipulator who had bent a brilliant man entirely to his will, and was now testing how far that control could be pushed. It was the beginning of the end between them. Soon after, the partnership shattered. Kelly, with his promises of alchemical gold, was the one the Emperor wanted. He stayed in Bohemia and was made a knight and grew rich on the expectation of the gold he could never quite deliver, and died years later in disgrace in prison, reportedly trying to escape. And Dee, the great scholar, gathered up what remained of his household and turned for home across a continent toward the house by the river he had left so many years before. He came back to Mortlake in 1589 to find it ruined. The library, that vast, irreplaceable library, the labor of his whole life, had been broken into and plundered during the years he was away. Many of the books were gone. The instruments were gone. The great collection that had made him the most knowledgeable man in England lay scattered, sold, or destroyed. The mob's work and the slow theft of years had hollowed out the heart of his life's achievement while he chased angels across Europe. And the world he returned to had changed its mind about him. The royal favor that had once made him untouchable had cooled. He was older now, poorer, trailing a reputation that had curdled from awe into suspicion. Whispers of sorcery, never far from him, had hardened. He petitioned the crown for help, for some position that might restore him, and was eventually granted a post far away in Manchester. A wardenship that brought him little comfort and less money among colleagues who seemed to have distrusted him thoroughly. When Elizabeth died and a new king came to the throne, things grew worse still. James was a man with a genuine terror of witchcraft. He had written a book on the subject, hunting the very thing Dee was suspected of. and there was no place in that court for an old man with a history of talking to spirits. Dee pleaded, near to the end, to be cleared of the charge of being a conjurer, asking to be tried so that he might prove his innocence. No trial came. The accusation simply hung over him unanswered for the rest of his days. He died at Mortlake around 1608 or 1609. The exact date is uncertain, which is its own quiet cruelty for a man who had once chosen the most important date in the kingdom by the stars. He died poor. In his final years, the story goes, he was reduced to selling off his remaining books one by one. The last of that great library, going piece by piece to buy food. The cleverest man in England, the Queen's own conjurer, ended his life selling his knowledge by the volume to keep from going hungry, and was buried in the church at Mortlake in a grave whose exact location was, in time, lost. It is the shape we have seen before. Great mind, dazzling height, and then a slow fade to poverty. The world he had served so brilliantly let him go without a sound. So what do we make of him? We could call him a fool, a brilliant scholar gulled by a cheap forger, who threw away his library, his favor, and his good name chasing visions in a black mirror. There is a version of the story that ends exactly there, and it is not a foolish version. The evidence for Kelly's fraud is strong. The angels asked for too many convenient things. The simplest explanation is usually the true one. And the simplest explanation is that a desperate, aging genius was deceived by a man who saw exactly how to deceive him. But sit for a moment in the harder version, because the thing that makes John Dee linger is not the fraud. It is the wanting. Here was a man who had learned everything a man could learn, who had mastered mathematics, read the libraries, advised the throne, mapped the routes for empires, who had stood at the absolute summit of human knowledge in his age, and found when he got there that it was not enough, that there was still a door he could not open, in knowledge he could not reach, a voice he could not hear no matter how he strained for it. And so he gave the rest of his life, and his fortune, and his reputation, to the hope that someone somehow could put him in contact with the thing on the other side of the door. That is not the story of a stupid man. That is the story of a man cursed with a hunger too large for the world to feed. The same hunger that made him great is the hunger that destroyed him. He could not stop at the edge of the known, the way wiser and smaller men do. He had to lean out past it in the dark, waiting. Was Edward Kelly and his crystals and his angels telling him at last exactly what he had spent his whole life desperate to hear? Of course, we will never know for certain what he was hearing in those long sessions by candlelight. A fraud's invention, the wanderings of his own brilliant, exhausted mind, or, and this is the possibility he died believing, something real. Something that genuinely spoke in a language older than the world. What we do know is this: the man clever enough to navigate the courts of empires could not navigate the one voice he wanted to be true. The cleverest man in England, undone not by a lack of knowledge, but by the one thing knowledge could never give him: the certainty that on the other side of the silence, someone was listening back. He spent his life leaning toward that silence, asking it to speak. And the great unanswered question of John Dee, the question his neighbors could not answer when they burned his books, the question we cannot answer now, is whether anything ever truly answered him. There is a room on the 33rd floor of a hotel in New York where an old man is dying. It is January of 1943, and the city outside is at war. Though the man in the room is far past the reach of any war now. He is 86 years old. He is desperately thin. For years, he has lived in this hotel on credit no one expected him to repay. And for years, his only steady company has been the pigeons he feeds at the public library and on the ledge outside his window. He talks to them. He has said more than once that he loves one particular white bird the way a man loves a wife. He was, not so very long ago, the most famous inventor on Earth. He lit the great fairs. He made lightning leap across stages while crowds gasped. He harnessed the fools at Niagara and turned them into a power for a nation. kings wrote to him, newspapers called him a wizard. And now, he is dying alone, with the pigeons owing money for the room. He dies sometime in the night between the 5th and the 6th of January. A maid finds him in the morning, the "Do Not Disturb" sign still on the door. And here is where the ordinary story of an old man's lonely death becomes something stranger. Because within hours, men arrive at the hotel, within hours, who are not family, and not friends, and not undertakers. They are from the government, and they go straight to his papers. Every notebook, every sketch, every sealed trunk of a lifetime's work is gathered up and carried away, to be examined behind closed doors by men whose job it is to decide what the public is allowed to know. But what was in those papers? What did the most brilliant mind of the age leave behind that made the state move so quickly, so quietly to take it? That is the question we are going to sit with tonight. Not to answer it. The honest truth is that no one can fully know. But we'll follow it all the way back to a storm on the night he was born. He was born at the stroke of midnight, between one day and the next during a thunderstorm. This is not legend. This is the story his own family told. In the small village of Smiljan, in the borders of what was the Austrian Empire and now is Croatia, on a night in the summer of 1856, the lightning was so fierce that the midwife is said to have called the newborn a child of the storm, and to have meant it as a warning. "This child will be a child of darkness," she said. And his mother answered, "No, you will be a child of light." You may take that exchange as true, or as a story polished with time. But it sits so neatly over the life that followed that it is hard to let go of. Because from the very beginning there was something different about the way the child's mind worked. Something that would lift him to the heights of his age, and something that would in the end leave him stranded there alone. As a boy, he was haunted by visions. Not dreams, visions, sudden and blinding, that would flash before his eyes in the middle of an ordinary moment. A word spoken aloud could trigger them. He would see a scene, a flash of light, a thing not in front of him at all, so vividly that he could not always tell the vision from the room. He spent his childhood learning to push them down, to tell the real from the imagined, and the effort of it shaped him. But the same strange wiring gave him a gift that almost no one in history had possessed. Nikola Tesla could build a machine in his head. Entirely. He could picture a device down to its smallest part, set it running in his mind, and leave it running there for weeks. Then he would return to it in his imagination and inspect it for wear, to see which parts had wobbled or worn or failed, without ever having touched a single piece of metal. He claimed he could test an invention to destruction without building it at all. Think about what that means. Most inventors fail their way forward. They build and break and build again. Tesla did the breaking inside his own skull, in the dark, and brought into the world only the things that had already survived. He was a creature of rigid habit and strange compulsion. He could not bear to touch hair. He was repelled by perils. He counted his steps and the volume of his food and demanded a precise stack of napkins at every meal. He worked himself to collapse and recovered with a force that frightened the doctors. He studied at the Polytechnic at Graz and burned through it with a ferocity that alarmed his professors, until, characteristic of the whole life to come, he ran past the edge of what the institution could hold and left without the degree. The vision that would make him famous came to him, of all places, while he was walking in a park reciting poetry. The idea of the rotating magnetic field, the principle that would let alternating current do useful work, that would in time electrify the planet. It arrived in his mind whole in a single flash, the way those childhood visions had. He is said to have grabbed a stick and drawn the design in the dirt to explain it to the friend beside him. He was in his 20s. He had almost nothing, and he was carrying in his head the machine that would run this modern world. He arrived in America in 1884 with a few cents in his pocket and a letter of introduction. The letter was addressed to Thomas Edison, and it is supposed to have said something close to this. I know two great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man. Edison hired him, and for a while the two of them, the established American genius and the strange, courtly newcomer with the unplaceable accent, worked under the same roof. It did not last. Here, we reach the one stretch of this story that is firm ground, documented and dated and beyond real dispute. The rest of the night will take us into stranger country. We will have to weigh what is proven against what is merely claimed. But the war of the currents is history, and it matters because the pattern it sets is the pattern of his whole life. Edison's empire was built on direct current, electricity that flows in one steady direction. It worked, but it had a crippling flaw. It could not travel. A direct current station could light only the few streets around it before the power bled away. To electrify a city, you would need a generating plant on nearly every block. Tesla saw another way: alternating current. Electricity that reverses directions many times a second. It could be sent across great distances at high voltage and then stepped down for safe use at the other end. It was the answer. It was, in fact, the answer. The one we still use today, in the wires behind every wall around you. But the two systems could not both win. And so there was a war. A strange, theatrical, sometimes ugly war, fought not only in laboratories, but in newspapers and at public demonstrations. Edison's side set out to convince the public that alternating current was a killer. They staged grim demonstrations. They lobbied behind the scenes for the first electric chair to be built using alternating current, so that the public would forever associate it with death. Tesla, by then, had found a partner who believed in him: the industrialist George Westinghouse. And the Westinghouse Company carried his system forward. The turning point came in 1893, when the Great World's Fair in Chicago was lit for the first time by Tesla's alternating current. Hundreds of thousands of people walked into a palace of light unlike anything in human history. And then came Niagara, the harnessing of the falls, the first great power station to send electricity to a distant city, was built on his designs. It was the moment the modern electrical world switched on. He had won. The current that runs your home tonight is his. And yet, here is the first turn of the pattern. The world does not remember it as his victory. It remembers Edison. It remembers the light bulb, the name on the company, the face in the school books. Tesla won the thing that mattered most, and walked away with the smallest share of the credit. He had, by some accounts, even torn up a contract that would have made him one of the richest men alive. Royalties on every unit of his alternating current ever sold, because his partner's company was struggling, and he valued the survival of work over the wealth it owed him. He gave it away. It would not be the last time. And it begins to tell you something about the man, that he was chasing something other than money, something he could see and the rest of the world could not, and that the chase would cost him everything he was owed. By the 1890s, the newspapers had stopped calling him an inventor, started calling him a magician. It was not entirely their invention. Tesla understood spectacle. He understood that a crowd that has seen the impossible will believe in it. And he was willing to put his own body on the stage to prove it. He would stand before an audience and let hundreds of thousands of volts pass over his skin, lighting lamps held in his bare hands, wreathed in sparks untouched. He would speak calmly while artificial lighting crackled around him. To the people in those halls, he did not look like a scientist. He looked like a man who had reached behind the curtain of the world and learned to work its machinery. In 1899, he went west to Colorado Springs, where the thin, dry air and the high storms suited his purposes. And there he built the most extraordinary laboratory of his life. A great barn of a building, with a tower and a copper ball at its peak. And inside it a coil of his own design, large enough to do something no one had ever done. He made lightning. Not a spark. Lightning. Bolts of artificial electricity that crackled from the tower in arcs, reported at over 100 feet long, with a thunder that was heard, they said, 15 miles away. The horses in the town panicked. People felt sparks jump between their feet and the earth as they walked. The grass around the building glowed. He had, in the most literal sense, cooled down the storm he was born under and made it in answer to his hand. And it is here, in that crackling laboratory in the mountains, that the documented story begins, for the first time, to blur into something else. Because one night, alone with his instruments, Tesla recorded a signal. A rhythmic series of pulses, regular, structured, coming, he believed, from somewhere far away. And he reached a conclusion that he was never able to walk back, that he had received a message, and that it had come from another world. From Mars, he suggested, or somewhere beyond. We should be careful and honest here, the way you always asked to be. What Tesla almost certainly detected was natural, a radio emission from a storm, or from a planet's own magnetic field. The kind of cosmic radio noise that science would not properly understand for decades. He was hearing the universe, but not a voice in it. And yet he believed sincerely that he had heard something trying to speak. He wrote about it. He was mocked for it. That is the moment the figure begins to tip. Up to here, He is a genius. Strange, but a genius whose claims the world could check and confirm. From here on, more and more, he will say things that no one alive can verify. And the great difficulty of his later life, the difficulty that hangs over everything still to come tonight, is that he had earned the right to be believed. He had been right when no one believed him before. So when he began to describe machines the rest of us could not yet imagine, who exactly was qualified to tell him that he was wrong? The greatest dream of his life was also the one that destroyed him. When he came back from Colorado, Tesla had an idea so large that even now, more than a century later, it sounds less like engineering than like something out of scripture. He wanted to give the world free power, not cheap power, not power for the rich, free. Wireless electricity, drawn from the earth itself and broadcast through the air, so that a man in a field anywhere on the planet could raise a simple receiver and draw light and heat and energy out of nothing. The way you might draw water from a stream. And he meant to build the thing that would do it. On the north shore of Long Island, with money from the most powerful banker in America, J.P. Morgan, he began to raise a tower. Wardenclyffe, it was called. A vast wooden structure, climbing nearly 200 feet into the air, crowned with an enormous dome and sunk deep into the ground beneath. Because the secret Tesla believed was the earth itself, which he thought could be made to hum with electricity and carry his power to every corner of the globe. He told his backer it would transmit messages, wireless communication across the ocean that Morgan could understand, and that was what the money was for. But Tesla's true ambition was larger, and when it surfaced, it doomed him. Because the dream had a flaw that had nothing to do with whether it would work. Suppose it did work. Suppose the tower truly broadcast power through the air to anyone, anywhere for free. Then how would you sell it? How would you bill a man for electricity that fell on him like rain, that he could simply reach up and take? There would be no meter. There would be no wire to cut off if he failed to pay. When Morgan understood this, when he understood that Tesla was building a machine designed on purpose to give away the very thing Morgan made his fortune controlling, the money stopped. The famous exchange has Morgan asking the only question that mattered to him. If anyone can draw on the power, where do we put the meter? And there was no answer. there was never going to be an answer. That was the whole point. The funding collapsed. Tesla scrambled for other backers and found none willing. The tower stood on the Long Island shore for years, unfinished, rusting, a monument to a future that had been switched off before it began. And then, in 1917, it was dynamited, torn down for scrap to settle the debts he had run up against it. The greatest single structure of his imagination ended as a pile of rubble sold by the pound. Just sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is the cruelest version of the pattern we have been watching tonight. He did not fail because the idea was foolish. He may not have failed on the engineering at all. We genuinely do not know whether Wardenclyffe could have worked. He failed because his idea was too generous to be allowed. The one invention that might have changed the world more than any other was killed not because it couldn't be built, but because it couldn't be sold. After Wardenclyffe, the money never really came back, and the man slowly began to drift past the edge of what the world would follow. In the last decades of his life, Nikola Tesla announced wonders. He would call the newspapers, often on his birthday, which became a strange annual ritual, and describe inventions that sounded like the contents of a future century. And this is the hardest section of the night, the one that asks the most of us, because we have to hold two things at once: that this man, who had been right where everyone laughed, and that he was now an old, isolated, increasingly impoverished figure whose grand announcements could no longer be checked against any working machine. He spoke of a weapon. He called it Teleforce, though the world would come to call it the Death Ray. A beam, he said, of concentrated energy could bring down a fleet of aircraft from hundreds of miles away. So terrible that it would make war itself impossible, because no nation would dare attack another that possessed it. He insisted it was not a ray at all, but a stream of particles, and that the science was sound, and that he had the plans. He offered it to governments. Some took the meetings. Nothing was ever built. He spoke of an earthquake machine, a small mechanical oscillator that, tuned to the natural resonance of a structure, could shake it apart. He claimed in one famous and probably exaggerated tale to have nearly brought down the building around his own laboratory with a device he could fit in his pocket. and to have had to smash it with a hammer to stop the shaking. He suggested that, scaled up and tuned to the Earth itself, such a machine could split the planet, as a boy would split an apple. He spoke of photographing thought, of building a device that could project the images in a person's mind onto a screen, because he believed, from his own lifetime visions, that the eye registered what the mind saw, and that it could therefore be captured. Now, how much of this was real? The honest answer is that we cannot fully separate it, and the inability to separate it is the tragedy. Some of what he described in those years was genuine insight, decades ahead of its time. He spoke of pocket devices that would let people see and hear one another across the world. And he was simply correct. Some of it was the grandeur of a brilliant, lonely old man, building cathedrals in the air because the world had stopped funding him to build them in steel. And the unbearable thing, the thing that keeps people arguing about him to this day, is that he had spent his whole life being the one who was right when no one believed him. He had earned a credibility so total that it outran the evidence. He could no longer tell, and neither can we, where exactly the genius ended and the loneliness began. That is the real cost of being so far ahead of your time. It is not that the world ignores you. It is that in the end there is no one left who can tell you whether you are still a genius or merely alone. And so we come back to the room, the 33rd floor, the pigeons gone from the ledge, the old man still, and the do not disturb sign on the door, and then within hours, the men from the government at his papers. This part is true. A federal office did move quickly to take possessions of his belongings after his death, and his papers were held and examined by the state for a time before most were eventually released and sent years later to a museum in his homeland. The official reasoning was the war. The worry that a foreign power or an enemy might get hold of something dangerous. That death ray, perhaps. Those plans he had always insisted were real. What did they find? The official answer is not much. They say the papers were examined, were judged to hold no working weapon, no secret that could turn the war, nothing that needed to be feared, speculation and old theory, the inventory said. The genius had been an old man with notebooks full of dreams. And maybe that is the whole truth. Maybe there was nothing in that room but the paper records of a mind that had outlived its own moment. But notice what the absence does. Notice how hard it is even now to be completely sure. Because some of those papers have never been fully accounted for to everyone's satisfaction. And because we have watched all night a man be doubted and then proven right, doubted and then proven right, until the doubting itself begins to feel unsafe. We are not going to build a conspiracy here tonight. There is no honest evidence for the suppressed genius, stolen secret version of the story. But we do not need one. The plain facts are strange enough. The most original mind of his century died, broke and alone in a rented room, and the state arrived before his body was cold to carry his thoughts away in little boxes. Here is what is not in doubt. Almost everything he was mocked for has come in some form to pass. The wireless transmission of information he was ruined trying to build, you might be likely holding in your hand right now. The remote control he demonstrated to a disbelieving crowd, the networked world, the devices that let us speak across oceans, the very current humming in the walls around you as you listen. His, all of it his, arriving on schedule, just without his name attached. He died believing the world was not ready for what he had seen. And the strangest thing about Nikola Tesla, the thing that lingers after all the death rays and the lightning and the pigeons, is that he may simply have been correct. That he was not a madman who imagined too much, but simply a man who arrived too early to be understood, and who paid for that the way such people always seem to pay, with his fortune, his credit, and his place in the story he had every right to own. He was born in a storm, and they called him a child of the light. In the end, that is exactly what he turned out to be. We are sitting tonight inside the world in which he switched on. We just forgot for a long time whose hand was on the switch. There is a legend older than Hinduism itself, older perhaps than any religion still practiced on this earth. It tells of a vast sea that once covered Central Asia, stretching north of what we now call the Himalayas, and in the center of that sea, an island. Not a small island, a great one, so beautiful the legends say that no one who saw it could afterward describe it accurately. And on it, a civilization of extraordinary people who had mastered sciences and arts that the rest of the world would not approach for thousands of years. They lived in complete isolation. They did not trade. They did not wage war. They did not even communicate with the outside world, except through one means: a network of tunnels. Deep tunnels. Tunnels that stretched for hundreds, even thousands of miles beneath the surface of the earth, burrowing under whole continents and oceans, connecting the island to lands its people would never visit on foot. For a long time this arrangement worked. The island flourished in silence while civilizations above rose and fell and rose again. But eventually, something came for them too. The legends are not precise about what. A great flood, perhaps. An invading force of terrible proportions. Whatever it was, even this hidden paradise could not survive it by staying in place. So the people of the island did something remarkable. They moved underground. They abandoned the surface entirely, took their knowledge and their culture into those tunnels they had spent millennia building, and rebuilt their entire civilization beneath the earth. The island above disappeared. The sea that cradled it dried and became desert. The mountains that bordered it rose higher and higher as the continents shifted. And below all of it, in the deep dark, this kingdom endured. Its name, depending on who is telling the story, is Agartha. Now, what makes this legend unusual, apart from its age, is a small geological detail that most people overlook. There is no sea north of the Himalayas today. There are only deserts. Two of the most inhospitable places on the planet. Bone dry, wind blasted, lifeless for hundreds of miles in every direction. But if you were to climb the highest peaks of the Himalayan range and look carefully at the ground beneath your boots, you would find something very strange. Fish bones, coral reef fragments, the fossilized remains of sea lilies pressed into the rock. The Himalayas were once the ocean floor. The Tethys Sea before the vast geological event known as continental drift pushed India northward into Eurasia and crumpled the Earth's crust upward into the highest mountains on the planet. This entire region was underwater. There really was a sea. Whether there was ever an island in it is another question. The story of how Agartha reached the Western world begins in Paris in the summer of 1885 with a man named Alexander Saint-Dié. Saint-Dié was a philosopher and occultist, well respected in French intellectual circles, deeply curious about the hidden roots of language and religion. He had recently finished a major work on the Jewish mystical tradition, for which he had taught himself ancient Hebrew. Now, he wanted to go deeper. He wanted to learn Sanskrit, the ancestor of all modern Indo-European languages, and through it, unlock secrets even older than those he had already found. Through a mutual acquaintance, he was introduced to a teacher. The man called himself Prince Harji Sharif. He was supposedly an Indian scholar who had left the subcontinent after the Great Rebellion of 1857 and settled in France, where he made a modest living as a bird seller and professor of Oriental languages. But in truth, his origins were hazy. Most historians believe he was actually Afghan, likely operating under an assumed name. But his learning was beyond question. The surviving manuscripts of their lessons, preserved to this day in the library of Sorbonne, are written in exquisite script and demonstrate a formidable command of what he taught. The mystery of Agartha was planted in the very first lesson. At the top of the page, Harji had written his credentials: teacher and professor of the great Agarthian school. Saint-Dié asked what this meant. Harji gave vague answers and moved on with the lesson. But the Frenchman did not give up easily. They studied together 3 times a week. Harji would sign each page of Saint-Dié's notebooks with his personal monogram as a mark of approval. Over time, the informal conversations between lessons became as important as the lessons themselves. Fragments survive written in Sanskrit. Phrases like elements for the Agarthian rite alone for the use of initiates, and the holy land of Agartha. And once, almost offhandedly, it said, how was he able to leave Agartha? Slowly a picture formed. Agartha was a hidden land deep below the surface of the earth, somewhere beneath the Himalayan mountain range. an enormous underground complex of cities, home to millions, ruled by a sovereign pontiff known as the Brahmatma, and his two colleagues, the Mahatma and Mahanga. The entire collected wisdom of every age, knowledge lost to the surface world through wars and floods and the slow rot of time, was said to be preserved in its vast stone libraries, carved into pillars in a secret 22-letter script called Vatanian. This script, Harji told him, went all the way back to the very origins of civilization, precisely 51,900 BC, and since then, it had been kept solely within the protected libraries of Agartha. Harji could write it as fluently as he wrote French. When Santiv asked to learn it, Harji wrote out the Frenchman's name in Vatanian characters with a small note beside it. Here, according to your ardent desire, but really, you are not yet sufficiently prepared for Vatanian, slowly and surely. According to Santiv's account, our Agarthian civilization had been driven underground at the onset of the Kali Yuga, the present Dark Age cycle of Hindu chronology, around the year 3200 BC. In the millennia since, hidden from the wars and plagues and collapses that ravaged the surface world, their technology had advanced far beyond our own. He described gas lighting, railways, air travel, and one detail in particular that stands out to the modern reader. He described pathways of communication made not from steel but from flexible glass, which did not deplete the carbon reserves of the planet. This was written in the 1880s. He was describing fiber optics over a century before their invention. The people of Agartha kept careful record of every discovery made by civilizations above, monitoring the surface world through their vast network of tunnels. But they had evolved separately for so long that even their bodies had changed. Santiv was particularly fascinated by one detail. The Agarthians had developed two tongues with which they could speak two languages simultaneously. He would return to this detail again and again in his writings, as though it held some deeper significance he could not quite articulate. Santiv compiled everything into a book. He called it Mission of India in Europe, Mission of Europe in Asia. Hundreds of copies were printed, and made ready for distribution across France. And then, without explanation, he ordered every copy destroyed. The reason has never been fully established. Some sources say he acted under orders from the great Agarthian school itself, told that the knowledge would not be understood, and that publishing it would be like casting pearls before swine. Others suggest something darker, that he was threatened with the dagger of initiates if he revealed their secrets. What we do know is that around this time, Harji's signature on the lesson pages grew sketchier, more careless, devolving from an elaborate monogram to a simple cross and then disappearing altogether. The lessons ended. The two men never appear to have spoken again. Santiv kept a single manuscript. When he died, it passed to his stepchildren, and eventually to a fellow occultist who published it in 1910 with several sections quietly removed. Those missing pages have never been recovered. If Santiv's account had been the only one, Agartha would likely have been forgotten as an eccentric footnote. But 37 years later, a Polish scientist named Ferdynand Ossendowski published a book called Beasts, Men, and Gods. Ossendowski was no mystic. He was a geologist and a chemist, fleeing Central Asia after the Russian Revolution, trying to stay alive. His book is an account of that desperate journey through Mongolia, and most of it reads exactly as you would expect: cold, hunger, violence, the daily mathematics of survival. But scattered through the narrative are moments that do not fit the rest. He describes occasions when everything around him simply stopped. Men froze where they stood, animals dropped to their knees, the wind fell silent, even the sun seemed to hang motionless in the sky. The herds of horses and cattle pressed flat to the ground, birds stopped mid-flight. When he asked an old Mongolian shepherd what was happening, the man answered plainly. "Thus it has always been," he said. "Whenever the king of the world in his underground palace prays and searches out the destiny of all peoples on the earth, the king of the world," the shepherd told him, "lived in a place far beneath the surface. He was attended by two companions, the Mahatma, who knew the purposes of future events, and the Mahinga, who ruled their causes. Together, they read the great book of human destiny. The shepherd spoke of this as plainly as he might speak of the weather. It was not belief, it was fact. The sky was blue. Water ran downhill. The king of the world lived beneath the earth, and sometimes he prayed. And when he did, the world above went quiet. On multiple occasions throughout his journey, when Ossendowski pressed Buddhist monks and lamas for more detail, a name was given: the kingdom of Agartha. He called it the mystery of mysteries. The parallels with Santiev's account, written 37 years earlier, was impossible to ignore. The same hidden underground kingdom, the same triple authority, the same location beneath the mountains of Central Asia. The obvious accusation was plagiarism, but Ossendowski kept a detailed daily journal. He brought back physical artifacts from his travels. And when the French philosopher René Guénon investigated the matter directly, Ossendowski stated that he had never read Santieve and had not heard his name until after his own book was translated into French. René Guénon found no reason to doubt him. And so, over the next 2 years, René Guénon conducted his own independent research, contacting scholars and monks across Asia. What he found led him to write his own book, The King of the World. In it, he confirmed that stories matching the Agartha legend were widespread across Mongolia and Central Asia, and could be found in some form in the traditions of most peoples on Earth. Three writers, working independently decades apart, describing the same impossible kingdom. None of them able to prove it existed. None of them willing to say it did not. There is one more thread to follow before we leave the story of Santieve. In 1935, a French esoteric scholar named Jean Réor, a close associate of Guénon, revealed something that had been whispered about in occultist circles for decades. He claimed that a secretive group of Hindus had been searching for a suitable Western student, someone sympathetic to Eastern doctrines, someone with the public platform to introduce those doctrines to Europe. They had chosen John Dee. Harji was the first messenger, but he was not the last. In John Dee's own notebooks, buried in an analytic index, there is a reference to a second teacher. He calls one of his notebooks the secret teaching of the Brahmins, communicated to me by the Rishi. Bhagwandas Raji Shri. The name is almost entirely composed of honorifics, but this was unquestionably a different man from Harji, a guru described by Raynor as far more serious, originating from North India. This second teacher apparently worked with Sanjeev on the deeper mysteries, the connections between the Vatanian alphabet, Hebrew root words, and Sanskrit. But at some point the project soured. The second Indian determined that Sanjeev was unworthy. The problem, as Raynor later put it plainly, was that even the most sympathetic Westerners could not resign themselves to not being superior to the rest of the world. Sanjeev had written in his book that Agartha would reveal itself only when Christianity fulfilled the commandments of Moses. In his final work, he stated that India would need to be converted to a Christian order. Whatever the East had offered him, he could not receive it without reshaping it in his own image. The teachings were withdrawn, and Sanjeev spent his remaining years trying to reconstruct from incomplete notes a system of knowledge he had been given only a glimpse of. The deeper you look, the more names you find for the same place. In Tibet, they called it Shambhala. It appears in ancient texts, foundational scriptures of Tibetan Buddhism, which were themselves allegedly brought out of the hidden kingdom. References to it surface in Hindu scripture too. The Vishnu Purana prophesies that it will be the birthplace of the god Vishnu's final avatar. But the legend is older than either religion. It predates written history entirely. It has been called the Forbidden Land, the land of white waters, the land of living fire, the land of the living gods. Every culture that speaks of it gives it a different name. None of them doubt that it exists. Always, the description is the same. A civilization beneath the earth, a green valley, extraordinary people, isolated by choice, ruled by a benevolent and powerful king. A place where love and wisdom reign, and where suffering, want, and old age hold no dominion. Always it is spoken of as a real place. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition holds that Shambhala will reveal itself to the surface world only when humanity achieves spiritual balance, a prophecy that mirrors almost exactly what Sanjeev wrote about Agartha. It is worth pausing here to note that the idea of a sacred world hidden inside the earth is not confined to Asia. In the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah, the Zohar, the foundational text, teaches that the Garden of Eden was not merely a metaphor, but an actual physical place located deep within the earth. It could be reached, the text states, by traveling through a cave. Specifically, the Cave of the Patriarchs, known to Jews as the Cave of Machpelah, and to Muslims as the Sanctuary of Abraham, one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in both religions. To this day, the cave has never been fully explored. Only a handful of its chambers have been assessed, each time by removing boulders and stone blockages, and always during brief windows of political upheaval. Both known entrances are sealed, one by a metal grate covered with a dome, the other by a single large stone. The Russian painter Nicholas spent 5 years and 15,000 miles searching for Shambhala. 5 of his men died on the journey. The closest they came, he wrote, was in the Altai Mountains, where an old sage led them to a small, abandoned temple and showed them the entrance to a tunnel sealed with carefully cut stones. The sage assured them that Shambhala would reveal itself when the world was ready. Eric turned back. And then, of course, there are the tunnels. In almost every corner of the world, ancient cultures speak of deep passages that lead somewhere else entirely. In Guatemala, more than 500 miles of tunnels have been mapped beneath the Mayan pyramid complex of Tikal. The Maya sacred text, the Popol Vuh, describes an underground realm called Xibalba, inhabited by powerful beings whose civilization vanished before recorded history. When 500,000 Mayans disappeared during the collapse of their culture, modern researchers believe the answer lies somewhere in those tunnels. In Mexico, beneath the Pyramid of the Moon, a secret tunnel was discovered in 2020 using subsurface imaging technology 10 meters below the pyramid floor. no entrance has ever been located. No one has been inside. In Egypt, the Giza Plateau sits atop an enormous network of man-made tunnels. Natural caverns and subterranean rivers that have been continuously mapped since 1978. In ancient times, the Egyptians called this place Rosta, which translates simply as the mouth of the passages, the entrance to the underworld. Ancient historians spoke of a colossal underground city beneath the plateau, 3,000 chambers deep, lavishly decorated, known in Egyptian legend as the City of the Gods. The Greek historian Herodotus, visiting in the 5th century BC, described 12 interconnected underground palaces of white marble, so elaborate he could scarcely believe they were the work of human hands. Walls covered with carved figures, courts surrounded by colonnades. Near one corner, a pyramid 240 feet high, with an underground passage by which it could be entered. He was told that underground passages connected them to the Great Pyramids at Memphis. 500 years later, the historian Strabo confirmed the same account. The city Herodotus described has never been found. In North America, the Navajos say their ancestors emerged from a world beneath Navajo mountains. The Aztecs believed they were one of 7 tribes who came out of the caverns of Aztlan. And there is an old Apache legend of a deep cave in Arizona, said to lead to an inner world inhabited by a people no one on the surface has ever met. In India, the ancient religions speak of Patala, which translates as that which is below the feet, a beautiful underground realm of jeweled cities, golden walkways, sweet music, and fragrant air. Its inhabitants are the Naga, a race of semi-divine beings, half human, half serpent, who occasionally take full human form. Rituals devoted to the Naga have been practiced across South Asia for at least 2,000 years. They are described as wealthy, proud, and powerful. Guardians of treasure, both physical and otherwise, and they live underground. Remarkably, a near identical tradition exists in China, where earthbound dragons, the Fuzanglong and the Dulong, dwell beneath the surface, guard treasures, and control the flow of water. The parallels with the Naga are so precise that many scholars believe the two traditions share a single ancient root. And here, a strange thread connects. Remember that Santiv was fascinated by the claim that the people of Agartha had two tongues, allowing them to speak two languages at once. He treated this as a literal anatomical fact, but when you consider the forked tongue of a serpent, and the Naga, the serpent people of Indian mythology, who live underground in a kingdom of extraordinary beauty, who guard ancient knowledge, who can take human form, the detail takes on a different color entirely. It is possible, though no scholar has made the argument directly, that the Naga are the Agarthians, or at the very least that these legends share a source old enough that no civilization alive today can claim to have invented it. Here is what we know for certain. The Himalayan mountain range was once the bed of an ancient ocean. Hydrological tests carried out by modern caving expeditions have confirmed the existence of large-scale cave systems beneath the surface. But the vast majority remain inaccessible. The deserts which stretch north of the mountains, where a sea once lay, are among the least explored regions on the planet. We know that 3 independent Western sources, a French occultist, a Polish scientist, and a French philosopher, each described the same hidden kingdom in strikingly consistent terms across a span of 40 years. We know that these accounts are corroborated by traditions far older than any of them, reaching back beyond written history into the mythologies of Tibet, India, China, Mongolia, and Central Asia. We know that across every inhabited continent, ancient cultures tell of deep tunnels leading to an underground civilization. Some of these tunnels have been found. Some of them are still being mapped. Some remain sealed. And we know that a quiet Afghan man in Paris once signed his credentials as a professor of a school that, by all surface accounts, does not exist. That a Frenchman spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he had been taught, and died believing every word of it. That when the lesson ended and Harji disappeared, John Dee continued to write about Agartha in veiled terms for decades. In an epic poem, in private letters, in the obsessive, unfinished work of his final years. Whatever he had been told in that study of Paris, it never let go of him. And we know that a Polish scientist, fleeing through the frozen wilderness of Mongolia with nothing on his mind but survival, watched men and animals fall silent together, and was told it was because of the king of the world who was praying. what we do not know is whether any of it is true. The evidence is not proof. It is something stranger than proof. It is a pattern. The same story, told by people who never met, in traditions that had no contact with another, on opposite sides of the earth, a kingdom beneath our feet, a civilization older than memory, tunnels that go deeper than anyone has dared to follow. But perhaps one day, someone will.